Hello, I'm Gemma and this is Non-Fic Books, and Happy New Year to you all. I'm going to start off this new year with a review video of a book that I read at the end of last year that was really quite a good read. It's Natalie Livingstone's The Mistresses of Cliveden, 3 Centuries of Scandal, Power and Intrigue, and this was published in 2015 by Penguin Random House and is 436 pages long, so it's a really nice, great big book to get your teeth into. This looks at 5 women who were, I'm not going to say the mistresses of Cliveden because one of them really wasn't, but were highly related to Cliveden, which is a country house in the south of England, which looks a little bit something like that. And these 5 women are throughout the history of the house. Obviously she has stuck with some of the more scandalous ones because there were more women related to the house. But these 5 women range from the mistress of the original builder of Cliveden, who was the Countess of Shrewsbury. She is the first section, and her name was Anna Maria. She was the mistress of Buckingham, who owned the house. He built the house with the intention of this being their sort of love nest, because he'd moved her into the family home with his wife, the very long-suffering, what's her name, Mary Villiers, who actually I came out really disliking Anna Maria because I thought she was an incredibly selfish woman who railroaded anyone and who was only out for herself. Which is not, I think, the impression Natalie Livingstone meant to give, because I think she liked her, but I thought she was an absolute cow and would really have rather known more about Mary Villiers, who was an incredibly intelligent woman, but who was stuck in a very difficult situation of having to allow this woman into her house and to sort of cohabit with her husband, or being kicked out of the family home and having to move back in with her parents after having been mistress of her own abode. So she didn't really have very much choice, and it would be her that I would love to read a book on, and I'd love it even more if someone wrote a historical fiction book on her, because I think that would be fantastic. And this was interesting because Anna Maria never actually became the mistress of Cliveden, because even though the house was originally built for her, in the end the king stepped in and banned Anna Maria from seeing the Duke of Buckingham because her son was really horrified about his mother's scandalous behaviour, and it was starting to affect his possible career in going into Parliament. And so she then eventually blamed it all on Buckingham, got back in with her son and remarried, and he died of pretty much a broken heart. So she never became mistress of Cliveden, and Mary Villiers, while she was sort of estranged from her husband, moved in and became the first mistress. So I was like, yeah, good on you, women. So it was a really interesting topic. I didn't enjoy the woman herself, but I thought the section on Anna Maria was very interesting because it shows how the house started to develop. The next one moved on to Elizabeth Villiers, who was about a century later, I believe, and she was not a beauty, but she became the mistress of, who was she? I've got some notes because this book has so much information. Mistress of William of Orange, and was obviously therefore quite scandalous, but she was not very pretty, but she was incredibly intelligent, and she enjoyed the company of sort of interesting, intelligent men who were maybe not the most sort of outspoken and gregarious. And Swift described her as one of the most intelligent women he'd ever met, and her life was fascinating. If anything, I thought that was the section that was the sort of least well researched. I don't know whether that's because of the lack of information available on this woman, or whether it just was an area that, because it was less scandalous, because it really wasn't massively scandalous, because they split up after 15 years. He gave her lots of money and she married and settled down to quite a sort of sedate life, really. But just became involved in politics in the sort of hostess way that you could in the past. That was interesting. I really liked her. I would definitely like to see if I can find out more about. Augusta, the next one, was the wife of Frederick, Prince of Wales, who was the son of George II, and they were the parents of George III. And this was interesting because there was a big difficulty between her and her husband and his parents. They were estranged for a long time. She was going into labour and Frederick whipped her into the carriage and took her away to another palace while she was in the middle of labour, putting both her and her son at risk because he did not want the child born in the same palace as his parents. So they were a very interesting couple. She then had quite a tough life because she was going to be the queen. Frederick then died before his father and she had to fight for her place and her son's place and to still be able to look after her son. And she had gone from the sort of public's darling to being totally vilified by the end of her life, rather unfairly. And that was incredibly interesting. But again, I would like to go and read a more thorough book on her because she lived a very interesting life. And when you've got only 436 pages to talk about 5 different women, you can only go into a certain amount of depth. The next woman discussed, we're moving on into the Victorian period, and I have rather a crush on her because I think she's incredibly beautiful, is Harriet Howard, who was Queen Victoria's best friend, and she grew up in her grandparents' estate at Castle Howard, which you may not know, but I think I've mentioned before is one of my favourite country houses, and I go there quite often, and I absolutely love it, so I was disposed to think well of her anyway. This section I thought was a bit strange because Natalie Livingstone focused on the sort of least interesting aspects of Harriet's life for the longest amount of time, and then she was just living a fairly ordinary upper class aristocratic life for the Victorian period. She was friends with Victoria, she had parties, but nothing overly interesting. She was very conservative, she didn't host great sort of soirees or anything. She was very beautiful and she was viewed as incredibly beautiful, but it was her latter part of her life when she became highly involved in politics, including the fight for the abolition of slavery in the US, which got her into a lot of hot water with people because obviously she had great estates where people were living in poverty and were so tied to the land that there wasn't very much distinction. So she was accused of a rather large amount of hypocrisy. But I thought that would have been the more interesting part of her life to really look at, and certainly the more scandalous side of her life. And that was only sort of touched on relatively lightly. So again, this is a woman that I would really like to go and pick up another book about because she sounds absolutely fascinating and she certainly was involved in some very tricky political things which would have been great to read more about. And then the last one, who is not related to the same families that tended to be, but was an American who came in and bought the house after Victoria. And Victoria was horrified that Americans had bought the house after it had been her best friend's beloved abode that she spent a lot of time. And this was Nancy Astor, who was the first female MP to actually serve in Parliament. She wasn't the first elected, but the Sinn Féin representative who was the first one elected refused to enter Parliament. So she was the first female serving parliamentarian in the House of Commons, and wow, she's a really interesting character. She was very gung-ho, she had a very American attitude, she was very sort of practical and helped out a lot in the war efforts in Cliveden when they built a hospital, and she wasn't a sort of talk down to people, make things better sort of person, but she would challenge people and sort of tell them if they weren't getting better that basically they needed to buck their ideas up. And she even did things like bet her watch that a young soldier would not survive to the next day because he was giving up too much. And he fought a bit more, he did survive to the next day, and she did actually give him her watch, which he then kept for the rest of his life. But wow, she's also an incredibly dislikable figure. She was very conservative. She, while not as bad as it was sort of portrayed in the press about the Cliveden set, she was anti-Semitic to the extent that it was noticeable even at a time where anti-Semitism was an incredibly sort of normal part of a lot of British people's lives and attitudes. She got more and more bigoted and conservative throughout her life. She started becoming much more sort of anti-anyone who wasn't white and well off. Much as she claimed through her politics to be for working class people, she really did become very sort of old-fashioned, and her sort of patronising attitude became bigoted and offensive and really ruined her relationship with friends, with family, with politicians, with people she didn't know, and she really did put a lot of people's backs up. She is absolutely fascinating, and I will certainly be getting a book more on her because she is just such a complex character, because she did incredible things, but she was also pretty darn horrible. So I think that's really interesting, because I think we have a little bit of a habit when looking at people in the past to make them a little bit too one-sided, and I think it's really interesting to see a woman who was obviously a rounded person and not necessarily in a pleasant way, but I really like reading about people who are human. This was great. As I said, the writing was enjoyable, but the content was varied depending on which sort of woman she was looking at. I don't know. She says that she has, well, it says that she has a first class degree in history from Cambridge, but she's also worked as a journalist. You can tell the journalist side of things because her writing is very easy to read and enjoyable. I absolutely flew through this, even though it's massive, and it really is not a book to be intimidated by. I would say this is definitely a popular history, even though it might look a little bit intimidating. But she also thanks kind of quite a large team of researchers for doing the research for her. And I don't know how much she did herself, but I don't know whether the imbalance between the women were because of her interest or because of the researcher's interest or because of the actual documentation available. But I really did feel certain sections were a lot stronger than others in this. So it's not a perfect read, but it's still a very, very enjoyable read and a really good introduction to some fascinating women that I would definitely like to go and read about again. So I enjoyed this. I think you should pick it up if you're interested in either Cliveden or historical women, because these are some really great characters. And if you like sort of people who didn't really live by the rulebook, some of these will definitely appeal to you. So hopefully you enjoyed this first review of the new year. If you've got any questions or comments, please leave them down below. And if you have read this book and you have recommendations based on it, again, please leave them down below. I'll see you in a video soon. Bye!